Today, we are going to be speaking to nutritionist Jiordana Saade. Jiordana specializes in food psychology and eating behavior. We will discuss topics from obesity and binge eating, retraining your brain for overcoming fearful thoughts, and developing thought patterns based on loving your body rather than punishing it. Jordana also includes hypnotherapy into her practice and runs a successful podcast called The Mindful Method. Go check her out, and we know you will enjoy today's episode. Welcome to the Live Well with Josie podcast, a space for women like you to enter with an open mind and heart and leave feeling empowered to live your best life full of intention. Here, we learn together and we grow together. Enjoy today's episode. Thank you so much for joining us. We are so excited to have you.
Oh, no, it's my honor. Thank you.
I want to start today's conversation with a background on why you chose to go into food psychology, what that means, and what was the driving factor to even getting to this point.
Yeah. So thank you so much. And throughout my story, I think I'll answer some of those questions as well. But essentially, my story started when I was super young. Like I was obese as a child.
Mm-hmm.
And at that time, the obesity rates were very low. So I was the only obese kid in class. And so, I was bullied a lot and made fun of. And this was really hard for me. And so when I was 8 years old, I went on my first diet because I was called fat by a boy I had a crush on. It was very embarrassing. And I was like, that's it. This is the last straw. And so I went home that day and I was like, I don't know what a diet really is, but what I do know is that if I eat food, it makes me gain weight. So I stopped eating altogether and I received a lot of validation from the people around me. So, my parents were like, oh, now we can see your beautiful face and you're growing up and you're becoming so beautiful. And the boy I had a crush on all of a sudden started talking to me and I had all these friends, and it really just reaffirmed that being thin meant I was lovable and being overweight meant I wasn't.
Mm-hmm.
And so this spiraled into decades of disordered eating and eventually substance abuse, because obviously as an 8-year-old child who was just literally starving myself, like that's not sustainable. So I became terribly afraid of eating any food at all.
Right.
And so what started to happen is I would go through these like binge and restrict cycles without even really knowing what I was doing. I would uncontrollably eat, and then I would be so guilty and shameful after what I had done. And so I would like stop eating altogether.
Mm-hmm.
And when I was in high school, I discovered drugs. So let me backtrack a second. When I was in high school, I had this boyfriend. I was so in love with him. He was like my first everything. And he broke up with me. And in the same week, my dad was diagnosed with cancer. And so it was like my whole world came crashing down. I had no idea what to do with myself. And I ended up actually just like stealing some of my dad's cigarettes. And so it kind of started there with like the substance abuse. And then all of a sudden I was like, oh, I'm a cool kid smoking my cigarettes. And so that led me to, then trying weed, and then weed was not good enough. And it went to like MDMA and ecstasy. And then I graduated by some Hail Mary. I don't even know how. And I went to university in Montreal, which in Canada is like a huge party city. Like it's known for that. It's a very student city. It's an amazing place. But that's really where the drug addiction kind of took over. And so I was addicted to cocaine. And in my second year, I was kicked out of school. They were like, you're not coming to class. I failed everything. My parents were like, we can't pay for you to party anymore, so you have to come home. Mm-hmm. So I moved back home. I was 21 at that point. And since I didn't really have access to my like typical substance, I started drinking and eating again. And at that point, I got pregnant. And that baby like literally saved my life. Because like I couldn't use any of my substances. I couldn't drink alcohol. I couldn't do cocaine or any of those things, or smoke even. But the one thing that was still there was food. And I started to realize in that pregnancy that I was really using food very similarly to how I was using substances at that time. And it was this very uncontrollable thing. And I totally understand, like when you're pregnant, you're going to eat more. And that's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about like, you've just had a whole meal and you can't stop, like you're going back for more. And so I had my son. I gained like 80 pounds in that pregnancy, but I had my son and I vowed, I was like, I'm going to get down to the bottom of my eating disorder. So when he was 9 months old, I went back to school. I went to study nutrition. I became a clinical nutritionist. I graduated as valedictorian with first class honors. And
Wow.
yeah, and so like obviously quite a polarizing difference. But
Yeah,
from
what a journey to go from barely graduating to being
yeah,
valedictorian. That's amazing.
thank you. And I think that that really just highlights like how passionate I am about this.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, it's really, it comes down to like, I'm thirsty for this type of knowledge. But yeah, so I graduated. I worked right out of school. I was super lucky. I got hired right out of school to work with a medical doctor. So me and Dr. Abraham grew this huge, beautiful obesity clinic. We've written 2 books together on reversing obesity and how it is totally reversible. And but I saw myself in every single patient. Like nobody wakes up and they're like, I want to be fat. It's just not a choice.
Right.
And so as I was making all of these meal plans, like they know what to follow. Everybody knows what's healthy and what's not. It's just that like we choose the unhealthy option anyways. And so I became obsessed with understanding like, why do people self-sabotage, right? If
Mhm.
you have a goal of weight loss, but you keep like eating junk food, like why does that happen?
Mhm.
And so I was like, okay, I have to go back to school. So I went back to school to study, to get a master's and PhD in behavioral neuropsychology, which is where I'm at now. So my entire practice is really rooted in this like brain behavior activity. And throughout the process of me going back to school and learning about the nervous system and learning like how it works and how it connects to the body, I was able to really like heal my relationship to food fully. And once I did that, I was like, this is so powerful. Like I have to share it with others. So that's how I ended up opening up my practice and became a psychological nutritionist.
That's amazing. Your story really resonated with me so much because I wasn't obese growing up, but I just always struggled because I grew quicker than the other girls did. And that plays a part in your psychology as well. And it was funny because my best friend and did you ever watch that Disney Channel movie Double Teamed with the two basketball players? They were bigger than like all the other girls in their grade. And that's what we always saw ourselves as because we were just bigger and we grew quicker than the other girls. And obviously we weren't the only ones, but out of our friends, we were. And it was nice to kind of have somebody alongside of me that was experiencing the same thing, but it definitely gets into your mind that you're bigger than everyone else. And why am I bigger than everyone else? And that was something that I struggled with myself in a different sense is being bigger and having a little bit more meat on me as well in that sense. It wasn't like I was like tall, skinny, lanky. I had meat on my bones as well. And I struggled with that. And so that also caused me to have this relationship with food where I depended on it. It was my crutch. It was something that I used for emotional stability, but it was also something that I then would feel so guilty and shameful about after. And so when I heard your story, I was like, gosh, I just resonate with her and her story so much in that sense. Obviously, they're different stories, they're different paths. Can you explain to us a little bit what is a psychological nutritionist and how does this help women who are struggling with binge eating or struggling with using food as a crutch?
Yeah, for sure. So before I even get into that, I actually would just want to touch on what you said about your story and how
Mm-hmm.
there's actually multiple studies that have been done for women or females who go
Mm-hmm.
through puberty earlier than their peers,
Mm-hmm.
that and then like the prevalence of an eating disorder later on in life. And there's a very strong correlation. So we can't call it causation, but we can call it
Mm-hmm.
correlation. And really what that comes down to is like if you're going through puberty before anyone else, like you're getting bigger before anyone else. Right.
Mm-hmm.
So like you're getting boobs and like, and so as a child, like the child's brain, and we can definitely dive deeper into this. I
Mm-hmm.
will go back to your question, but the child's brain is like reliant on feeling like accepted. Like its only goal is to understand like how to survive. And that is totally related to like attachment and how it feels like it fits in essentially. And so if
Wow.
as a child you're like you all of a sudden are different than everybody
Mm-hmm.
else, then that is going to like teach the brain like, hey, there's something wrong with me. And then whatever the mechanism is, that child will learn like, how do I not have something wrong with me? Okay, like food is the thing that's making me big, so I need to like stop eating that. And then it just like starts the cycle.
That's so
Yeah.
fascinating and being in this space. I you learn so much about how your psychology and your upbringing has so much to do with where you are now and what you've dealt with, especially with your relationship with food. Honestly, just having that conversation with people our age who are like childbearing age as well is so important because we're in that generation, I feel like, where we've just really struggled with this growing up, and so many women can resonate with this. One of the many reasons I wanted to have you on today to, discuss all the things. But I really feel like this can help us help bring up our children. And if we're blessed to have children, or when we're blessed to have children, in order for them not to feel that way that we felt.
Yeah. Yeah. So, I mean, I would say like a huge population of my clientele are mothers, like young
Mhm.
mothers, or people who eventually want to have children and don't want to pass this on to their kids. And obviously, like, I mean, I'm going to track that because I'm a mother. Like, I have a 7-year-old and a 9-month-old, but it is so important and it's so possible.
Mhm.
And there's also like so many reasons we don't even have to get into that now or here, why our generation struggles more than like some of the other generations. But just to like give you guys a really good understanding, like a psychological nutritionist is really just, okay, so you're a holistic nutritionist, and that was my original training. And we learn a lot about the body, right? We
Mhm.
learn like how to reverse chronic conditions and like diabetes and metabolism and like what's like healthy and what a carb is and what a fat is. We learn all that stuff, right? We learn like how it digests into our body and like how bad sugar is and all that fun stuff. But we don't actually learn about like why we eat, right? We learn about what to eat and what not to eat and all of those great things. But actually, after I became a holistic nutritionist, my eating disorder was worse than it ever was before, because
Mhm.
now I was all of a sudden terrified of everything that I was eating, and like I knew
Right.
exactly why.
Right.
And so it really like, when we talk about psychological nutrition, it's really not emphasizing on what we're eating, because most of us know what's healthy and what's not. Like, we know McDonald's is like not the best meal. It's really emphasizing and focusing on why we eat and the motivation behind eating behavior. Because a lot of people that struggle with like emotional eating, stress eating, or have like guilt or shame feelings around food, they are very, very disconnected from their true hunger and full signals, because for the longest time, they have been trying to manipulate, like, how many calories do I need to eat? How many macros do I need to eat in order? And so when the brain tries to take over and say like only this amount of calories, only X amount of grams of protein or whatever, we become disconnected from the true hunger signals from our stomach. And if we're disconnected, we'll never really be able to intuitively eat, right?
Mhm.
And the thing is that we're born into this world as very intuitive beings. Like, I have a 9-month-old baby, and like I cannot overfeed that girl, right? And so
Mhm.
we all have that innate process. We've just unlearned it because people have told us, no, don't eat this, don't eat that. We've dieted multiple times. And so it becomes very difficult and very overwhelming for the average person to be able to really like understand what their body needs at that time and trust that. Right.
Mhm.
Because when I was really struggling with like binge eating, if someone were to tell me, like, what does your body really want? Like intuitive eating, like intuitively, what do you really want right now? I would say like a whole box of donuts, like
Right.
that's truly what I want. But that's because like I was so disconnected for so long. So part of my work with clients and part of what psychological nutrition does is it helps you to reestablish those hunger cues, those true hunger cues, because your body wants to be healthy. Like, if your body's holding on to any amount of weight at all, there are imbalances. It's dangerous for your body to hold on to weight. It's not something the body wants to manifest. And so if that's the case, there are imbalances in the nervous system and in your motivation to engage in eating behavior. And there are imbalances in the physiological body. So, we're talking metabolism, thyroid conditions, like potentially pathogens, that kind of thing.
Right. So, what would you say would be the biggest factor into binge eating specifically when it comes to the connection to psychology with that?
Yeah, it's actually extremely simple.
Mhm.
A history of dieting. Like,
Mhm.
that's all it is. I think that you could probably think, and hopefully your listeners can as well, think of somebody who they grew up with who like never had an issue with food, never had an issue with their weight. Like, they were just always naturally skinny. They could eat whatever they want, and they ate whatever they want, and then they stopped when they were full, right? Like, they
Mhm.
heard that signal. The only thing that's different between them and or like somebody who does have an issue is the way that they think about food. And so if you've ever had to go on a diet, if you've ever had to try and control or restrict a certain food group, it is going to have psychological effects because we have so many different parts of the brain, and not to get like super neurosciencey here, but the part of the brain where all of our goals and dreams live, like I want to be thin, I want to be rich, I want to be whatever, lives in this like very conscious part. It's the conscious creative, and that's the part that makes us human, right? That's why you like the color blue and I like the color pink. It's like that's what makes us human. But the part that deals with all of our basic needs is a very primitive part, and that primitive part of the brain is over 500 million years old. Like, in a war of like who's going to win, the primitive brain's always going to take over. And that's why a lot of this overeating behavior, binge eating behavior feels like a compulsion, because you can't consciously control it. Like, you don't want to do it, but the primitive part takes over, and it's like, I have to have access to safety. And so anytime you diet, you basically tell the primitive part of the brain that food is scarce. You said you have a dog, right?
I do have a dog.
Okay. So if you were to give your dog a milkshake and an apple, like, would the dog be eating the milkshake and being like, oh, I shouldn't be eating this?
No way.
Right? So it doesn't matter if in your brain or your conscious brain, you're like, I can't have sugar anymore, right? The primitive part of the brain does not understand that. It's the same animal brain that all animals have. So primitive part of the brain is going to think all food is scarce, and it's literally going to increase cravings for the specific food that you're trying to reduce. And this is why it's very difficult. And this is why diets have a 98% fail rate, because every time you go on a diet, you're restricting either amount of calories, a food group, like you're taking something out, right?
Right.
And so that just isn't going to work long term, because the primitive part of the brain is always going to want to gain access to survival. It's its job.
Wow, that's fascinating. I've realized so much just with going through my own journey is that when I am so hyper fixated on everything that I'm eating, that's when I feel the worst. But when I'm out and I'm enjoying food and I'm with people and I'm just, I still am aware of what I'm eating because I want to be able to feel my body well, but I feel so much better than if I'm hyper fixating on absolutely everything that I'm eating.
Yeah. There's a couple of things that I want to touch on based on what you just said. The first one is that, your brain's number one job is to remain consistent to its identity, right? It's why you know who you are when you wake up every morning. You don't have to reteach yourself how to brush your teeth. Like, this is a very adaptive mechanism that the brain has. But so if you're eating something and you're like, I shouldn't have done that. I'm like, what you're really telling the brain is like, I'm a failure. And because your daily behaviors match your deepest beliefs about yourself, your behavior is going to match the thought that you have, not the goal and the dream. So if the goal is I want to lose weight, but the thought is like, shouldn't have done that, then your behavior is going to match failure behavior.
Yeah.
Right. And so it doesn't actually serve you at all to feel guilt or shame. Like, what does guilt and shame really do? Nothing. It doesn't change anything other than keep you stuck. Right. And so part of the reason why this feels like a cyclical cycle is because you restrict yourself. You're like, oh, I got to hyper focus on it, whatever, I'm going to do that. And then you have something that like isn't in line with your goals. And then you feel guilty and shameful about it. And then it's actually like, then that drives the next binge. Your binge starts at the binge before. It depends on the narrative around it, right? Because remember what I said, the only difference between you and somebody who's never had a binge eating disorder is the way you think about food. Do you think that somebody who's never had an issue with their weight is like, uh-oh, shouldn't have had that Girl Guide cookie? Like, they don't think about that. They're like, okay, that was delicious.
Yeah.
Right? And so it's like, so part of that like guilt and shame cycle is what drives the next thing, because your behaviors are going to match the way that you think about yourself. Right. And I think that there also is something to the fact that, how on every cigarette pack, there's like the lungs or like the disgusting tongue. And it's like, oh my God, this is like definitely killing you, but like, I'm going to do it anyways. Right. Like that, I know it's not good for me, but I'm going to do it anyways, really just proves that for the most part, human beings are not motivated by fear. Like, we're just not. It's like fear mongering, like, really doesn't do anything. If there's nobody around and it's left up to you, if it doesn't kill you instantly, you're probably going to do it. Right. And so there's no point in like shaming yourself or like being, like you said, you have an autoimmune condition. So I can only imagine that there's a strict diet that would go along with that autoimmune condition. Right. And so when you're going out and you're like, oh, I can't have those fries, like what you're doing is creating that restriction, and then you're going to want them even more. There's a very big difference between like eating, and this isn't to say that like we should all just eat unhealthy. Like that's not at all what I'm trying to say, right? But
Right.
there's a very big difference between like eating because you love yourself, like eating well because you truly, truly love yourself
Hmm.
versus like eating well because you hate yourself and you have to punish yourself and like you're bad and like, and that's a very different energy, right?
I love that you just brought that up. I think that's so important because I also have realized I had a conversation with somebody recently, and we were talking about how there's like two things I want to say in this one little concept, but we were just talking about how so many people in this space, especially the holistic space, also use fear mongering to bring in clientele. And it's like, let's stop the fear mongering. And so I've had to be very cautious about who I'm listening to, who I'm following, even if I believe what they believe. And I really think that they're so great at their teachings and what they do, and they're still fear mongering. It is so detrimental on our mental and physical health when we're constantly consuming all of this. And also, so we were just talking about that. We're like, oh my gosh, like so many people are resorting to that fear mongering tactic when they're trying to promote themselves, promote their business, promote their beliefs. And it's like, if you just start to tell people, like, it's gonna be okay, baby, like, we can do this, like, you're gonna be able to live your life and enjoy your life, but we're still gonna love ourselves and not punish ourselves, because our bodies are trying to work for us. That's what we always forget, is our bodies are trying to work for us. So we need to work in a partnership and love our bodies and nourish our bodies because we love it. And just like you said, not because we're trying to punish our bodies for working against us. And I've realized, because I was very strict for a long time with certain things I could or could not eat because of my autoimmune issues, I have felt so much better eating those foods that I'm not supposed to eat, but just realizing that my gut needs a diversity of foods. And as long as, if I'm eating it, I'm enjoying it, I know it's nourishing my body, and I'm loving my body, and I'm fueling my body because I love my body, I usually feel so much better than if I were to eat this like AIP meal.
Of course.
Mm-hmm.
And part of that is just because there are so many different parts of the nervous system, right? So like nothing that we do in full restriction, nothing we do out of like hate or anything like that is going to have a positive effect on our body. Like it's just not possible. And so just based on the like, a lot of people out there like trying to fear monger, and that's how they're getting clients. When somebody meets me and they're like, I want to work with you, like there is like so much zero pressure, because
Mm-hmm.
ultimately like the client has to want to so badly for like this to really work, and want to be ready to like let go of that type of like mentality of it has to be black, it has to be white, it's all or none, I'm on a diet or I'm not on a diet, because or else it's just not going to work.
Mm-hmm.
And when you allow yourself to have like that diversity, like you'll notice like you're not going to want to overindulge. There's no punishment there. It's like when
Mm-hmm.
we can just take the effing pressure off, like when we can
Mm-hmm.
just like take the pressure off ourselves for a second, you can get back in the driver's seat and you can really make a decision that's in line with your goals. But the more pressure you put on yourself, like I want you to think about pressure as like, like a ticking time bomb, right? Like it's like the only reason that it can lose control or explode is because it's under a lot of pressure. So
Mm-hmm.
when we talk about binge eating, a lot of the time there was this loss of control around food. Well, if you don't want to lose control, stop adding pressure.
Mm-hmm.
Like that, it's very simple. It really just comes down to that. And the work then becomes, can you be okay with like having a bite of a cookie and not freaking out about it?
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. I think it's really important too that there are so many people who are so far, you can do whatever you want. And then there's people who are like, you need to restrict all of this stuff. Find a happy medium. Like
Yeah.
there is a happy medium, and we don't have to be all or nothing in any aspect. Like
Mm.
you can nourish your body, you can nourish your body well, but just not be hyper fixating it and then implementing everything that Jordana is telling us today too, because that'll help us so much. That's why you're here. Okay, so let's go ahead real quick. In general, something that is huge here in America, we have such an obesity issue, and there are so many people who struggle with detoxification issues, with eating all the right foods and not being able to lose a single pound. So I
Mm.
really want to get into that with you and get into your thoughts, your research, your ideas behind all of that. But I also want to know, like, how do genetics work with food psychology? So if this plays into that, you can snowball into everything you want to. But if you need to break it down, then break it down.
Okay, so let's talk about genetics first. So, and then we can talk about stubborn weight. But so the interesting thing about genetics is that, like, okay, yes, of course, we have the gene, right? So with genetics, there's the genome and then there's the phenome, and that's how genetics work. And so the gene is like the DNA, like that's the code, that's the blueprint. And that really does get passed on from our parents, etc. So you might notice that like everybody in the family is overweight or everybody in the family is thin. And a lot of people think that like weight and weight disorders are very genetic, but there is actually no gene at all ever that makes one person more likely to be overweight than another, because
Wow.
being overweight is not a disorder. It's like, it's
Mhm.
actually a brain disorder more than anything. Like, it's not
Mhm.
like something physiological that can go wrong in the body. There are lots of physiological disorders that can be a result of being overweight that can be a bit genetic. So let's say mom struggles with blood pressure, so does everybody else. Like, if you also have a weight problem, blood pressure might be the thing that goes first, right? And so that is where the genetics play into that. But so we have the genome. The genome is the blueprint, it's the genetic code, and then we have the phenome, and the phenome is the environment. And that is actually what turns on or off the genetic code. So let's say you have like two twins separated at birth, okay? They both have the genome for diabetes. Now, if one child grows up with like candy at the end of the table every day, and then one child grows up with like a bowl of fruit at the end of the table every day, which one is getting diabetes? Like, it's not both of them,
Mhm.
right? And so we actually do need that environment component to turn it on, and that's called epigenetics.
Mhm.
Those are very, very like layman's terms of it, but hopefully digestible for you guys. And so when we talk about genetics, like, it's never an excuse. There's nothing more frustrating than when people are like, well, it's just in my genes. Like, I'm always going to be overweight. I'm like, no, no, no. The only reason why you and your family are is because you think about food differently than other people. And because there is that environmental factor.
Mhm.
Now, if we think about it from a sense of like nervous system, right? So when we talk about things like addiction, or yeah, like we'll go with addiction. There's a really good story. I can't remember like exactly how it goes, but anyways, again, there's two twins in this story, and one of them becomes an alcoholic. Like, their dad is an alcoholic, basically. One of them becomes an alcoholic. The other one becomes like the opposite, like so studious, so successful, whatever. When you ask the first twin, like, why did you become an alcoholic? She says, because of my dad. And when you ask the second twin, like, how'd you become so successful? She says, because of my dad. Right. So you can be in the exact same position and have the same like environmental factors, but totally internalize it completely different. And
Mhm.
so, and that's really up to you. Like, that's where we can get in the driver's seat and get like into this empowered state of like, I can do something about this, right? Like, this isn't my cross to bear. It's not like this is like I have to suffer my whole life from this. It's like, you're in the driver's seat, you can do something about it. Going right back to genetics, just very briefly, there is a gene that can happen, or a genetic mutation, and it's called the DRD2 gene. Now, the DRD2 gene is a genetic mutation specifically on dopamine. So when we talk about like addiction and overeating, dopamine is like really prevalent. That's the one neurotransmitter that is going to lead to a susceptibility and overconsumption of food or any other substance, basically. And when people have a genetic mutation, especially from both parents on the DRD2 gene, they are more likely to engage in behaviors that will lead them to seek more dopamine. So this means that person might be more impulsive, that person might engage in substance use more often. And because we're talking about food, there is a susceptibility for them to eat more food. But again, there is no gene that's like weight gain. That doesn't exist.
Right. Wow. That's something that really blew my mind when I started to learn about all of this. It's crazy how your genes can load the gun, but really the environment just pulls the trigger. The one thing you hear all the time is it's my genes, it runs in my genes. They use it as an excuse. And that's so frustrating, is especially with me having an autoimmune disease too. There are autoimmune genes that run in the in the family, but just like we said, it's literally your environment that triggers it. So I really think that is extremely important that you bring that up, because so many people are just like, no, it's just my genes, but it's like there's so much more to that.
We're not just talking about like the bowl of candy versus the bowl of fruit. We're talking about like what are the thought, like the internal environment, like what are the
Absolutely.
thoughts that you're telling yourself. So if you're telling yourself like I'm a victim of my circumstances, like oh no, poor me, like that's exactly what you're going to experience, right? And so
Yep.
it really is like part of my job is really empowering the client to be like, whoa, no, I can take control of this. Like I am the one, because the reality is, and this isn't to fear monger, like life is too short, truly.
Right.
Like it's just
Absolutely.
it's just too short. You have no idea how long we just don't know, right? So if you're
Mm-hmm.
going to spend your whole life, or I would say waste your whole life, like
Mm-hmm.
being a victim of your circumstances, like wow, that's what a waste. Like,
Absolutely.
and so it doesn't have to be like that.
So I'm going to kind of veer off real quick in a different direction that
Yeah.
kind of goes along with this. I want to know
Yeah.
your thoughts. So I knew somebody who went through breast cancer, and they were like, I'm not going to speak life into it. I'm not going to, like, it is something I'm going through. It is something that, I have to really love myself through it and do all the things that I need to do, but I'm not speaking life into it. And so what are your thoughts on that? Because it seemed to help her so much. And she wasn't pretending she didn't have it. It wasn't her like pushing it aside, but it was her truly being like, I'm not identifying as this. And I'm
Yeah.
going to do what I need to do, support myself, go through the treatments, do those things, but I'm just not going to speak life into it and continue to say, I have this every single day, or I'm a survivor, I'm a warrior, whatever, every single day. And that is something that I kind of took into my own journey as well, because I realized so much that I was almost identifying with my autoimmune disease, that it was really something that when I stopped doing that, that I realized it had such a hold on me. I think it has really helped me not really identifying so much with it.
Yeah. Really good things. Okay. I'm just like writing it down. I'm like, I don't want to forget. Okay. So here's the thing. This is literally what happens. Like your entire reality is based off of like what your nervous system tells you. Like you literally do not experience anything until your nervous system tells you to experience it.
Mm-hmm.
So like you walk down the street and you stub your toe, like you're not feeling any pain until the brain's like, this hurts, and then sends a message back down like that. So your entire reality is based off of the thoughts that you think.
Mm-hmm.
And so, and there, it can't be rejected. Like we can't like be in denial. That's not
Mm-hmm.
helpful. So there has to be like acceptance of where we're at, which is what I love that you said about you, that a person that you're talking about,
Mm-hmm.
that case study. So, but when you have a thought, okay, when you have a thought, it releases chemicals into the bloodstream. So those
Mm-hmm.
chemicals are like in the form of hormones and neurotransmitters, and those neurotransmitters and hormones are going to bind, like travel in the bloodstream and bind to your cells, and they're going to tell those cells how to behave. So
Mm-hmm.
if the thought is like, I have cancer, I have cancer, I have cancer, you're going right to the cancer cell. Like,
Mm-hmm.
okay, like this is valid. This is what this exists.
Mm-hmm.
Your brain is obsessed with being right. Obsessed.
Mm-hmm.
It's like part of it's like the whole thing is like the brain just takes in truths and like creates validation or non-validation, puts things into compartments, right? And so the more that we speak truth or speak life, like you said, which I love
Mm-hmm.
the way that you said that, into whatever, the more that becomes a reality. In behavioral psychology, we actually call this cognitive fusion. So it's one of the reasons why I don't believe that things like, Alcoholics Anonymous is very effective. Like, I mean, of course, there's been so much efficacy there. And I'm not saying that if you've been an alcoholic, you have to have a drink or anything like that. But
Mm-hmm.
if you stand up every day and you're like, hi, I'm Jordana, I'm an alcoholic, like, what do you think's going to happen?
Mm-hmm.
you know? And so I was an alcoholic. I was addicted to cocaine. I was an alcoholic. I can have a drink at Christmas and it doesn't like turn into some spiral, but that's because
Mm-hmm.
I'm no longer identified with that, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so I think it's very, very important that you're very intentional about what you tell yourself and what you tell your body, because you are the only one that governs that experience. I don't believe that anybody intentionally manifests cancer. I don't think you believe intentionally manifested an autoimmune disorder. That's not what I'm saying. But once
Mm-hmm.
it's there, you actually have the power of like, are we going to heal this thing and move through it? Or are we going to let this completely take over?
Mm-hmm.
And this is why mindset is so important.
Mm-hmm. Thank you for touching on that. And that's why I definitely wanted to touch on, this person wasn't denying that they had it. This person wasn't denying that like it was a thing that was happening, but it was more so just in the sense like, this is what's happening right now in my life. And going to pray. I'm going to make sure I'm doing all the things that I know that I need to do to nourish my body. But I'm going to live my life. I'm going to continue to like enjoy life, enjoy my family, do the things and move through this, but not be talking about it, breathing life into it every single day, not be focusing on like, this is me now. It's just a thing that's kind of going alongside of her journey. And that was a huge game changer for me in my journey as well. It's interesting how some people's journeys can really affect you on your own journey when you hear just like a tiny little thing like that. So knowing that your mind is so powerful and has such power over your body as well. Your nervous system has an effect on everything, your entire well-being. Can you explain a little bit about generational trauma? You just kind of explained genetics a little bit. I want to know a little bit about generational trauma, and I've heard you talk about the mother wound before. So I would love for you to touch on that topic.
Yeah. Everyone loves to talk about the mother wound, but like it really is so important because your relationship to food is the most important relationship you're ever going to have. Like that's your relationship to survival. It literally outweighs your relationship with your husband, with your kid. Like it's like your relationship to survive, right?
Mm-hmm.
And your relationship to food really comes from your mother and the mother wound. And I actually get a lot of backlash about this. So I'm just going to preface this by saying that there is not a single mother out there that intentionally does this to their children. Like
Mm-hmm.
even after all of my years of training, like this is what I do for a living, I am still going to inflict trauma onto my kids. And that's just the reality. Like
Right.
Dr. Gabor Mate is one of my huge mentors in this world and in this like space. And he always says, if you're worried about screwing up your kids, don't worry, you will. And
Yeah.
that's the truth, right?
Yeah.
And so basically what the mother wound is our mother is our first access to food. So we come into this world and to really talk about the mother wound, we have to talk about the attachment theory. So I'm just going to touch on that very briefly, but the attachment theory is the most important theory that governs human behavior that we have that exists. And so we can talk about classical conditioning, operant conditioning, humanistic psychology, all that fun stuff, but none of that fucking matters because the attachment theory is the only thing that matters for human behavior. Once we have attachment, then we can go into all this other fun stuff. So what attachment really is when we come into this world as babies, we are completely helpless. Like we cannot do anything. We rely on the care and the love, the unconditional love from the people around us to survive. That is a very human trait. Most animals, like when they're born, they can get up and walk and fend for themselves, like and never see their mothers again. But humans are very different. And that the baby brain comes in already knowing this, right? And so the baby knows. And the fact is, we have the longest attachment period than any other species. Like, I still rely on my parents for like some things. And so we're really, really wired to understand that not only are basic needs important, like having food, water, shelter, sex, etc., but in order to get those basic needs, we need attachment. We need the love and the care from the people around us to provide us with those basic needs. And that's why this is the most important theory, because the brain's number one job is to survive. And so everything that you do, especially as a child, is going to be rooted in this like need to understand how to survive and how to thrive. And you can't do that without attachment. So the caveat here, though, is it has to be unconditional love. That's how we create a secure attachment. Now, what unconditional love looks like, and it's very difficult. So from a mother's perspective, let's say you're like going out with your kid and your kid wants a toy and you say no, and they throw a tantrum and you're like, stop crying, you're embarrassing me. Or you're like, good girls don't cry, right? So what the child hears is like, mommy's mad at me. Like that's what the child brain is thinking, right? The mom thinks like, I'm just trying to shut my kid up so we can get on with our day, right? But the subconscious part of the brain that deals with survival in the child's brain is thinking, if I express myself, I'm not lovable. And therefore, I'm going to lose my attachment. And if I don't have attachment, I'm not going to have access to food. And if I don't have access to food, then I'm going to die. And so, like, consciously, that child isn't like, I'm going to die because mommy yelled at me. But subconsciously, the way that the brain is encoding this is through that, like, I'm not going to have access to food and I'm going to die. So when the mother does not have time for the kids, when the mother doesn't breastfeed. I didn't breastfeed my kids. I'm not saying it's wrong or right or anything, right? These are just how we can create insecure attachments. But when the mother does not have time, when you're crying, mom doesn't come, mom's busy, whatever, you don't get what you need, or when mom shames. So when like big girls don't pee their pants or anything like that, you basically learn that there is conditions to the love. And if there are conditions to love, then it's an insecure attachment. So what does this really mean as it relates to food? Well, if the brain feels like there's an insecure attachment, then eventually what the child learns is it learns not to cry. It learns not to throw a tantrum, and it learns to change its own behavior to keep attachment, to keep love, right? And so by doing that, we reject our needs, we reject our everything, and we try and keep attachment. Now, if the brain feels like it's in danger all the time, like you talked about growth versus fixed mindset, there are only two states of being for your cells. Like on a cellular level, you're either in a state of growth or you're in a state of fear. That's it. Right. So if there is that fear, the brain is going to want to have access to food because that's how we survive. And that's how we develop that like unhealthy relationship to food. It has nothing to do with like us needing more food. It has everything to do with like us wanting to cope like emotionally and us feeling like we need to have access to it in order to survive.
That just blew my mind. When you think about it, because first of all, you're right. Humans in general just need to have that attachment so much more. Then I think that's probably why also when we see animals like little babies by themselves, we're like, oh my gosh, where's their mother? Like, we get that feeling because it's like we would have needed our mother, but they're okay. Some animals need their mother, but we get that feeling. And I didn't even think about that. Like we truly as humans just need that so much. And every little thing. I love that you did preface this though by saying like you're gonna mess up your kids one way or another. Like you can't help it. You can do your best, but it's just gonna happen. But I just really think that's so powerful too, to realize like your words have so much power when it comes to that.
Yeah. And just keep in mind that this is all really happening at a subconscious level. So like that child is not thinking like, oh, like mommy doesn't love me. So like now I need to eat some sweets. Like this is very, very, very subconscious. And from a mother's perspective, as I am an imperfect human who's a mother, there is a way, like you're never going to be perfect. It's not that I don't yell or shame at my kids. It happens. Like I'm human, right? But how we actually train the brain to not need that coping mechanism of food, because if hunger is not the problem, eating is not the solution. And so that child is going to learn to use food as a coping mechanism, and it's not going to solve any problems. It's actually only going to create a bigger problem, right? And so from your perspective, if you've just yelled at your kid and you don't know what to do, all you need to do is teach that child how to emotionally regulate, right? What I often find is that with parents, and I used to be guilty of this, is that we yell at our kids and we get upset and then we just like don't say anything about it. Like we just leave them to themselves. And then a child's brain doesn't know how to emotionally regulate. Doesn't have the emotional capacity to do that. So it's going to look for something outside of it to make it feel temporarily better. Right. But if you just go to your kid and you're like, listen, sweetheart, I'm so sorry. Like mommy's not perfect. I'm so sorry. And I love you. And that's forever. Like that's all you really need to do, because now you've taught that child that like, even when mommy gets upset, she still loves me. Right.
It's from your great great grandmother to your great grandma to your grandma to your mom, then to you, and then you're just going to pass it down. There are things that are embedded into us so subconsciously that we don't recognize, and some things like later on we could be like, oh my gosh, that is exactly why I'm doing that. Or if you're in a room, say you're in a room with your mom and your grandma, and you see a couple things, how they're interacting, you're like, that's why I do what I do. Or that's where it came from. What's going on? They can be the best people in the world, but they can still be passing on some of these things, and you just recognize how that potentially has affected you in certain ways. But the way that it connects to food is so fascinating, because your brain, like you said, is just so connected to that survival mechanism.
That's the whole thing for the brain. it's like I'm either surviving or I'm dying. Like that, there are two states. It's growth or fear. And like anything that's going to harness fear, like remember that your body and brain like literally don't know the difference between like financial stress, emotional stress, relationship stress, or like I'm literally running away from a bear for my
Right.
life stress. Like it's just cortisol. It's the chemicals that are dumped into the bloodstream: cortisol, adrenaline, norepinephrine, right? And so, and then your left hemisphere, the left part of the brain that like is obsessed with telling you a story, will tell you a story about what's happening. Oh no, I'm going to be late for work. I'm going to get fired, whatever it is, right? And so like whatever chemicals are dropped in the bloodstream is what's telling the body what to do. And so it literally is survival or not. And so if you're in this constant state of like whatever your left hemisphere is telling you, if you're in the constant state of chaos, if you're in a constant state of stress, if you continually tell yourself, I'm not safe, there's something wrong with me, I don't fit in, I'm not good enough, I'm not pretty enough, I'm not smart enough, whatever, all day long, like of course the brain is going to need a coping mechanism. Like of course the brain is going to be like, I'm dying and I need to have access to food right now, whether you're hungry or not. Right.
Right.
And so it really just becomes like one of the reasons why we develop an unhealthy relationship to food is because it literally temporarily regulates a dysregulated nervous system. It makes us temporarily feel better. The brain doesn't like to feel dysregulated. It means we're in danger. And so what you're doing is you're reaching for a coping mechanism that's going to give you instant gratification. It's going to turn off that brain instantly, but you're sacrificing long-term pleasure because you're not really dealing with the root of the problem. You're just like putting a Band-Aid on it for a second.
What would be your tips for somebody who really struggles with self-regulating, separating that fight or flight response from using the coping mechanism of eating and being able to differentiate the two and what those feelings are, why you're having those feelings? What would be your biggest tip to help themselves start to self-regulate?
Yeah. So I think that the first thing is like a lot of people are really afraid that if they stop dieting, they're going to gain weight. And I think the first step has to be you have to take the weight loss out of it just for a moment. Not because that's not a goal, but because like the more you're fixated on like, am I going to lose weight? Am I going to lose weight? The harder this whole process is going to be. Because to answer your question, like how we teach the brain to regulate is we teach the brain it's safe. And in order to do that, you have to learn to like yourself, you know? And so it really comes down to like you developing whatever type of practice works well for you. So if it's a journaling practice or a yoga, like a movement practice, like walking or listening to a book or like just like really being able to like nourish yourself, you have to be able to like learn to love yourself and treat yourself well so that the brain doesn't feel like it's always in danger. And that literally is like the most important step. And it's very hard for people to do if they're constantly obsessed with weight loss because they're tying their weight to their worth. They're like, if I'm overweight, nobody's going to love me. And then I don't love me. And that might be fine. Like it's not that we want to be overweight. It's that like, if you actually want to reach your goal of weight loss, you have to do it through love. You can't do it through hate.
Absolutely. There are so many people who just think that all they need to be doing is reading self-help books. And there's some great self-help books out there, but they can also cause even more turmoil because you're thinking that you're not doing enough. And now you have to do all these other things. You have to start having this 10-step morning routine and this 10-step evening routine. But the fact that you said, take a walk and listen to an audiobook, or take a walk, listen to a podcast, go do something that you enjoy. I think we get so disconnected from just life in general and what life was meant to be originally, because we just have this go, go, go mentality nowadays. We have so much stuff that we have to do. Work is our lives and work. We just have so much stuff going on. And like you said, our bodies cannot differentiate if we're running away from a bear or if something small just happened. And we have those triggers so many times every single day because of the world that we live in now. And so being able to find those things that are intentionally suiting us, like for ourselves, and not just because somebody else told us that we need to do it, but because it's actually fueling us and helping regulate us for the way that we are and what we enjoy and what our bodies like is so very important.
Yeah. It really comes down to like, even with what you're saying with the self-help stuff, like the underlying narrative there is still, there's something wrong with me. And
Right.
so if you actually really want to change, you have to give up that identity. You have to give up, there's something wrong with me. And you have to focus on like every day and every way I'm getting better and better. And you can read all the self-help books you want, but nothing's going to change because your subconscious is still wired the way that it is. And that's where things like hypnotherapy come in. Like hypnotherapy is a tool I use in my practice all the time, and it's very effective. Alone, is it going to cure food addiction? Maybe, probably not. Right. But that's why we have like a programs put in place that like include that. Like it's a good tool. It's a tool to get in the subconscious, but it's not like the whole answer. But yeah, like I agree. But literally the first step has to be, you have to give up the victim mentality. You have to give up that there's something wrong with you and like get empowered.
Real quick, we'll discuss what your thoughts are on food addiction, why food is addictive, how companies have created it to be addictive, but also why our brain is how it can wire itself to be addicted to food.
Right. So there's actually quite a lot of research that's coming out now because obesity and food addiction is such a prevalent problem in North America. Because obesity actually on its own has nothing to do with the food. It's like, of course, this is a brain disorder. Like nobody wants to be obese. It's not an active choice, right? And so there are actually like three kind of like predispositions that could make somebody like become addicted to food or become obese, et cetera. And so the first one is like the food, which we're going to talk about. The second one is there has to be restriction. So that's the diet, like history of diets. And the third is that guilt and shame narrative, right? So I think we talked about the restriction and the guilt and shame enough. Let's talk about the food. So the reality is, of course, like when we think about, and this is going to be a little bit dark, but like when we think about big pharma, when we think about like the big food companies, like the government, like their job is to make money. That's what their job is. And so from everything from the coloring of the packaging to like what is actually inside the food is designed for the consumer. It's designed for you to come back and buy that product. And so like these foods are highly palatable. Like this, we're no longer talking about like, oh, this apple is so sweet. We're talking about like something completely chemically made that is actually very similar to cocaine. Like there is a huge study, it was done years ago by Dr. Nicole Navina. I was obsessed with her. She did this whole study with rats and how they were actually more addicted to sugar than they were cocaine. And this is like revolution. This is like crazy, right? So, and part of the thing is that we're actually wired for food. Like we know we need food to survive. We know we don't need cocaine to survive, even though it's addictive. We are always going to gear more towards food. And then there's this whole other problem where, you know, foods that are government subsidized. So like foods that are cheaper are highly palatable. And so we have this whole like socioeconomic issue where people in a lower socioeconomic status can really only afford foods that are extremely addictive, which keeps them unhealthy, overweight, etc. So what these highly palatable foods do is they literally train the palate. So we have like taste buds on our tongue, and those taste buds are going, if we continue to expose the taste buds to highly palatable foods, the taste buds are going to like be trained to only want those foods. And then things that are just like a normal whole food will not feel as delicious as the other ones. Like it's not going to release dopamine, right? So anything that is going to be unnaturally affecting our neurotransmitters is going to release dopamine. Dopamine is the molecule of more. It is not the molecule of pleasure. Dopamine is the molecule of more. So when we release dopamine, it makes us want to engage in more of that behavior. So these highly palatable foods are really manipulating the dopamine feedback loop. So you're eating it, it's releasing a shit ton of dopamine. And then you're like, I need more of that. Right? You're not like, I feel great. You don't like take a bite of chocolate and you're like, that's enough. Yum. You like take a bite and you're like, oh, I'll have another bite. You have to come in and stop yourself, right? And so essentially with this whole like food issue, it's a bigger issue. It's a government issue. And it's very easy to like untrain your palate, but you just have to do it slowly. And the reality is like, you know, even companies that are making food in North America are making that same food with a different ingredient list in places like Europe, right? Because Europe actually cares about their people. Like they have very strict food laws. And so like ketchup made from Heinz is completely different here than it is in Europe. And that's because like here there is no food rules. Like it is actually on the onus of the consumer to say like, hey, this is poisonous. Rather than the company. If it's not going to kill you instantly, the company can put whatever they want in there. And they're number one goal is always going to be profit. And so just as you wouldn't like pick something up off the ground and just like put it in your mouth and be like, wonder what this is. Like you should always, always, always be reading your ingredient list. Forget about the chart that tells you the calories, the protein, any of that. Like just forget about it. It's very easily manipulated. You want to literally look at the ingredient list. It goes in order from what is most in the package to what is least in the package. So if the first ingredient is sugar, like honey, you're eating sugar, you know? And so this is just like a much larger problem. But of course, the foods that we're eating are literally designed for reconsumption. And especially the foods too that are like diet or like sugar-free, but are still taste sweet. Those ones are even more problematic because what's happening is like you're exposing them into, so your taste buds are like, hey, something sweet is coming. Now your taste buds are going to send a signal to your cells. Something sweet is coming. The cells are going to open up and expect glucose. And if glucose is not there, they're going to stay open all day long and be like, where's the glucose? Where's the glucose? So it's going to increase your cravings and you're going to store many more things because the cells are like open for storage, right? It's open to expect something highly palatable.
Absolutely.
And so yeah, so it's a disaster. So it just, yeah, I mean, it's a major problem. Of course, I want cake for breakfast, lunch, and dinner. Like, duh, it's delicious, right? But like when you train the brain away from those things, I don't wake up and think about it all the time. Like when I was really struggling with binge eating and like I was very addicted to food, like I had to like physically stave off those feelings. Like I had to like restrict them. It's like, I want it, but I can't have it. And then eventually I'd give in and have way too much. But now it's not like those feelings or those thoughts run in my head all day. They do not take up any mental real estate. If we have cake, like I'm definitely having some, you're never going to be overweight if you don't overindulge. And so it's really about training the brain to be moderate with these foods and not needing that like overconsumption.
So you already said read the ingredients list, but what if somebody is still, what if somebody is at that point where they're like, but I need to do something extreme to help me stop this right now before I really indulge in like, okay, learning the ingredients, reading the ingredients list. What would you say would be your biggest piece of advice then?
Yeah. So like, first of all, hypnosis, I offer a free hypnosis on my website. That's a really good place to start. Like that kind of running in the background is going to help. That's obviously not the only thing. The second thing is like, okay, honey, listen, like really listen to me. Your brain is just a big muscle. It's just a bunch of wires and programs based off of what it typically does. So like, I wouldn't expect you to sit at a piano and just all of a sudden play Bach. Like that's not realistic, right? So don't expect yourself to be able to be moderate around foods if you've never been moderate around them, right? This is something you have to actually intentionally practice. So like one thing that I do with my clients is like, I've spent an entire day with the client having her eat one Oreo, take a bite, put it down, take a bite, put it down, go do something else. People don't practice that. Right. And so like, I would actually say like intentionally take time out of your day. Let's say you love donuts, buy a donut, spend the entire day practicing, have one bite and put it away and go do something else. Right. Nobody practices that muscle of let's put the fork down. Right. And then you eat the whole thing and you're like, where did it all go? And now I feel awful. Right. So it actually just like intentionally practicing this is the easiest way to train the brain. That in combination with hypnotherapy and like you're set, you don't even need to work with me.
That's awesome. All right, before you have to go, I want to ask you some rapid fire questions. But before before we get into that, is there anything else that we didn't touch today that you wanted to make sure that you touched on before we get going?
No, I think I just want to say that, like, listen, if you're in that situation, I've been there. It's not like I'm this like stick thin nutritionist that's like never had to deal with weight gain. Like I've been 300 pounds, I've been under 100 pounds. And I just want to say that like truly there is an answer and like you do not need to suffer with this. Like this is not something that like you need to carry with you for the rest of your life. So get empowered and let's do the damn thing.
Awesome. Before we do rapid fire questions, why don't you go ahead and tell everybody where they can find you?
Yeah. So I'm on social media. I'm not a very techie person. So you can find me on TikTok and Instagram. I will admittedly say Instagram, I understand. TikTok, I'm still really getting the hang of.
Same girl.
And yeah. I also have a website. So I'm at the Mindful Clinic on Instagram. I'm just Jiordana Saade. Yeah. And then I also have a podcast where I talk a lot about this stuff, like to nausea of food psychology.
It is so helpful. You have so much valuable information that it's not talked about enough. So I just really, really appreciate it. Okay, real quick before we go, let's go ahead and do some rapid fire questions. Okay. All right. So, what would be your superpower if you could choose one?
Oh, invisibility.
Have you taken any personality tests?
Yes.
Myers-Briggs, do you know that one?
Yeah, I'm
What are
ENFP.
You're ENFJ,
Yeah.
so extrovert. Love that. What about your Enneagram?
I don't know it, but I just bought a book to read.
Oh, okay. You're gonna have to let me know what it is. Okay, a meal that you could eat for the rest of your life.
I like stir fry. Like I'm a stir fry person, I think.
Nice.
Yeah. Yeah, because
Good.
there's a lot of flexibility there. Yeah.
You're right. You can incorporate whatever you want into stir fry.
Yeah.
And then two things that you would take with you on a deserted island.
I think I would take like a knife and a lighter.
Good choices. Good choices. All right. Thank you so much. This has been such a pleasure. I could talk to you for hours. You have so much information to provide us, but I would just want to thank you, Jiordana, for just spending so much time with us today and giving us so much invaluable information that we cannot thank you enough on. I know you're going to really touch so many people because so many people, especially in America, struggle with this. And I'm just so grateful for you and all that you do and for spending time with us today.
Thank you. That was so lovely. Thank you for having me. I really appreciate it.
Thank you. Thank you so much for joining us on this episode of the Live Well with Josie podcast. If you enjoyed today's episode, please don't forget to leave a comment and review, as we would greatly appreciate it. Also, please remember that nothing discussed here today is to be used as medical advice to diagnose, cure disease, prescribe, or treat illness. These conversations are simply to be used as educational resources for living a life with intention. You can find me on Instagram and Facebook at Live Well with Josie and my website, www.livewellwithjosie.com. See you next time, friend, and until then, stay intentional.